Boldwood presents The Wrong Woman, written by O.J. Mullen and read by Sarah Barron. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Prologue, 1998. Shouting wakened the tiny figure in the bed. He rolled over, rubbed the sleep from his eyes, and stared at the ceiling. Angry voices weren't new. 6-year-old Jonathan McMillan had grown up hearing them. They scared him. He buried his head under the duvet, put his fingers in his ears and tried to blot them out. Like many children his age, Jonathan was afraid of the dark, so a lamp was left on to keep the monsters in his young imagination at bay. As he slept, the superhero figures he'd got from Santa Claus, Batman and Robin, the Hulk and Captain America, stood guard on the bedside table, and underneath, his collection of DC and Marvel comics sat in a neat pile on the floor. Jonathan couldn't read them, not yet. His mummy did that, but he was happy to just look at the pictures. Tonight it wasn't Dr. Octopus or the creatures hiding in the bottom of the wardrobe that had disturbed him. It was his parents fighting downstairs. He scrambled out of bed to the landing and sat on the top step, afraid to go further, his little body trembling inside the Spider-Man pyjamas while the two people he loved most in the world screamed at each other. His daddy called his mummy a name Jonathan didn't understand. Something smashed against the wall and she yelled back. For a moment there was silence and the boy thought the row was over. He was wrong. It was only beginning. His mummy was talking, saying something he couldn't make out. Whatever it was sent his daddy into a rage and he roared, "You fucking whore!" The child heard the slap of skin on skin, then his mummy crying, and a silent tear, the first of many, slipped down Jonathan's cheek. Suddenly the glass door in the lounge shattered and his parents fell through it into the hall, locked together, his father's hands round his mother's throat, her punching him until he let go. They sensed their son on the stairs and drew away from each other, red-faced and panting. His daddy said, "It's okay, son, it's okay. Be a good boy and go back to bed." Jonathan stayed where he was, sobbing so hard he almost couldn't breathe. His mother had known this moment would come and dreaded it. Now it was finally here. Witnessing her little boy's distress without being able to comfort him was even more terrible than she'd imagined. Her heart was breaking. The lies didn't come easily, but were spoken gently, quietly, asking the child to believe them. "Go back to bed, sweetheart. Everything will be okay. Everything will be all right." Lifting her coat from the hall stand sent him out of his mind. He ran to her, begging, "Please, Mummy, please don't go." She knelt beside him, so close he could smell her perfume and see the purple bruise around her eye. She held his shaking body tight. "Darling, I have to. I'm sorry." No, take me with you. I want to go with you." She glared over his shoulders at her husband. "You can't, Jonathan. I want you to come with me, but you can't." Why? Why can't I?" she faltered. "It isn't possible." His father yelled at her. "Tell him why. Go on. Tell your son why you can't take him." "Peter, don't do this. He's just a child." "He deserves the truth." "Peter, for God's sake, don't." He grabbed the boy and spoke to him, his voice cracking with pain. "Son, listen to me. There's a man in a car at the end of the street. She's going to meet him. It's not just you she's leaving, it's both of us." Jonathan didn't understand what the words meant, though they terrified him. He clung tighter to his mummy's legs. She buttoned her coat and spat her contempt at her husband. "You bastard! What good did that do?" "At least he knows. It doesn't change anything." The boy pressed his back against the door, barring it with his outstretched arms, screaming his anguish while the warring adults towered above him. No, don't leave me. I love you, Mummy." His mother hesitated, wanting to scoop him up, wanting to whisper reassurances as she tucked him into bed and kissed him goodnight. Except it wouldn't be true. The man she was running to had made it clear he wasn't prepared to raise somebody else's child. He wanted her, and only her. She defiantly lifted her trembling chin as waves of sadness welled up inside her. Her son sobbed, wild-eyed with sorrow. "Please, Mummy, please don't leave me. I'll be good. I promise I'll be good." It took all she had not to give in. From across the hall, covered in broken glass, her husband goaded her, playing on the guilt she was suffering, every word meant to wound. "What kind of woman leaves her child? What selfish, soulless bitch does that? You're not fit to be a mother. If you walk out that door, I'll make sure you never see your son again. You hear me? Never." She balled her fists and rounded on him. "You think this is easy? You think this is what I want? I should have done it long ago, only I didn't have the courage. This is my chance to be happy, maybe my last chance. Threats and emotional blackmail won't stop me taking it." She picked up the suitcase Jonathan had watched her wordlessly pack that afternoon. When he'd asked, "Where are you going, Mummy?" she'd searched for a reply. "Mummy has to leave." "Why?" She still didn't have an answer for him. At least not one that would do either of them any good. "Don't worry, I'll visit you." It sounded inadequate, and it was. Jonathan asked, "When?" Her lipstick had smeared and she'd lost an earring, a detail the boy would remember for the rest of his life. "Soon, very soon." She hugged him, tenderly brushing a strand of fair hair from his tear-stained face, and forced a smile that disappeared before the words were out of her mouth. "Cross my heart and hope to die. Do as Daddy says and go back to bed." No, I want to go with you. I want to go with you." She looked at her husband and shook her head. He moved between them as she opened the door and stepped into the cold night air. Jonathan raced upstairs and stood on the bed watching her walk towards a future without him. Eventually, he lay down and cried himself into a sleep, torn by nightmares even all his superheroes together couldn't fix. The boy outgrew the Spider-Man pajamas. The comics and action figures ended up on the shelves of a charity shop, replaced by Nintendo and Super Mario, and the world kept turning. It was years before he lost hope and stopped waiting for the woman who'd given birth to him to make good on her promise. She hadn't then, and wouldn't now. Part 1. Chapter 1. Grapevine Advertising Agency, Boswell Street, Glasgow. Tony's voice cut across the room when she came through the door. Every head turned in Julia's direction exactly as he intended. "On behalf of myself and your grateful colleagues, let me say how much we appreciate you breaking into your busy schedule to be here. Glad you could join us, Julia. Sorry, Tony, the traffic." Tony Connors, the founder and MD of Grapevine, one of Scotland's foremost boutique advertising agencies, was wearing a beige linen ravier, more at home on an August day in Nice or Portofino than a muggy morning in Glasgow, over a t-shirt and jeans, and looked younger than his 51 years. Tony usually managed with a light, if cheeky touch, understanding that creative people were a special breed who danced to a beat only they could hear. But when he was making a point, his sarcasm became a blunt instrument that rarely missed its mark. Julia found a seat near the back, too flustered to notice the man standing beside him. Tony dredged a half-smile from somewhere and continued what he'd been saying before the interruption. "If you're curious about where Ellis got his suntan, I can tell you. He spent the last decade in South Africa. Cape Town's loss is our gain. He comes with the best references I've seen and a track record that blows most of us out of the water. He could have gone to London. Ogilvy, Sum, or any of the big players down there would snap him up. Instead, don't ask me why, he decided to return to his native land." Somebody shouted, "Cue the piper!" and everybody laughed. Julia couldn't see Ellis's face until he lifted his head, and his eyes held hers in an intense stare that made her uncomfortable. Tony let the laughter die before he went on. Okay, maybe that was a bit over the top. He hooked a thumb in Ellis's direction. But I'm serious when I say Grapevine is fortunate to have landed this guy. I'll be giving him the tuppenny tour, so you'll have the chance to make the case for the defence. Tony paused and scanned the crowd. One more thing. He's only just arrived in the country. Give the poor fella a break and save the salt mine stories for later, eh? He won't believe you. I've already told him you're the best paid bunch of scruffs in the city. He clapped his hands. Okay, people, let's get at it. It's Monday. Anything can happen. In Julia's office, the Scottish rollout of a new range of loans and mortgages, the latest offerings by one of the major banks, lay in her desk where she'd reluctantly left it on Friday night. The campaign had been signed off and was ready, apart from a few details that had still to be agreed. She'd considered coming in on Saturday morning to finish it, but suggesting that to her husband would have started another row and spoiled the weekend. Their careers stole enough from their lives without giving up more. She'd been introduced to Rob at a party, seen his blue eyes and known he was the guy she'd been waiting for. Now they were married and had recently moved into their first real home together after renting an overpriced shoebox. Rob was with the Galloway, Bartholomew and Figgis firm of architects based in Park Circus. Building was booming again, and he was up to his eyebrows with client meetings, site meetings, meetings about meetings. It seemed to never end, and Julia wondered how he coped with the pressure. She was a senior accounts manager at Grapevine, a job she loved, but that came with more stress than she wanted. Her team got together every Monday to go over the schedule for the week ahead and tidy up outstanding pieces of business. Calling the two people she managed a team was stretching it a bit. Ravi and Olivia were typical of the talented people Tony took on. Young, bright, full of ideas and enthusiasm, who didn't mind working odd hours at short notice to meet the deadlines glorified sweatshops like advertising agencies were known for. Ravi was Ravi Malik, a gangly 6-foot-tall 23-year-old who made self-deprecating cracks about his height before anybody else could. His specialism was graphic design, and Julia hadn't worked with many better. He was irreverent, football-mad and easy to get along with. She liked him and laughed at his daft jokes. Olivia Hassel was the same age, but could hardly have been more different. A petite, quietly spoken graduate of Strathclyde University's business school, capable of thinking on her feet and distilling a product's USP into a few sharp lines. This morning they were in good form, sharing matey chit-chat about the weekend. Ravi brought Julia in. And were you dancing on the tables anywhere we'd know? Please don't tell me the police were called. I'll need more coffee to handle that. No and no, Ravi. Now, if you don't mind, can we cut the comedy and do what we get paid for? She snapped like a humourless prude and wished she could take it back. Normally she gave as good as she got, but for some reason the familiar banter had irritated her. Ravi and Olivia were up for it, which meant it was her. As they were about to begin, Tony breezed into the room, followed by Grapevine's star recruit, and Julia got her first real look at Ellis Kirkbride. With carefully cultivated designer stubble, collar-length dark hair flecked with grey at the temples, he was more handsome than he'd seemed from a distance. Of course the suntan helped. He had a mulberry leather satchel and a camera slung casually over his shoulder, which confirmed her opinion he was a poser. When he saw her, he ran a hand over his jaw, and Julia felt vaguely uncomfortable for the second time. Tony said, "Sorry to break in unannounced. Please tell me we aren't interrupting anything too important." Tony Connors was a busy man. It was unusual for him to take a personal interest in a new employee. There had to be a reason. He said, "I need a word, Julia," and threw a fake smile at Ravi and Olivia. "You guys should grab a quick break away from this slave driver." He grinned as though he were joking. In fact, with his characteristic lack of subtlety, he was reminding the two juniors how unimportant they were. tactlessly signalling they weren't part of the conversation. Julia didn't disguise her annoyance. "Was that really necessary, Tony?" He feigned surprise. "Was what really necessary, Julia?" "Shutting them out like that." "Is that what I did? And please apologise on my behalf. Assure them it wasn't my intention to put them down, that they're valued and valuable members of Grapevine whose contribution, blah, blah, blah. You know, the standard guff. And the answer to your question is yes, unfortunately it was necessary. I'm doing the rounds, introducing Ellis to everybody and their granny. A waste of time because he won't be working with them. But he will be working with you. I'm bringing him onto your team, effective immediately. He can use Sylvia's old office until we sort something else out." He held up his hand to stave off her objections. "And yes, before you say it, you're right, you ought to have been consulted. No argument." He shrugged indifferently. "The boss took an executive decision, what can I tell you?" Julia swallowed her anger. This wasn't the first time the MD had undercut her. Tony's off-the-cuff style was famous. Anybody who was unhappy with it was welcome to close the door behind them on their way out. Her mouth set in a line that left no doubt about her feelings. "You mean you took an executive decision?" Tony didn't notice, or if he did, he didn't care. "Correct. I mean, I took an executive decision." He stepped back and studied her reaction. "Are you saying you aren't okay with Ellis joining you? Because now's the time to get it out in the open." "Will it change anything if I'm not?" He made a you-know-better-than-that face and pursed his lips. "How long have you been with Grapevine, Julia?" "Too long." "Me and you both. Then I'm surprised you need to ask." The MD leaned over the desk to emphasise his point, and there was fire in his eyes. "I won't change a damn thing, but you can lie to yourself that you stood up to the big bad boss if it helps. When word gets out, your street cred will be sky high, and I won't tell if you won't. Here's the deal. The Jungle Drums are saying we're going to be asked to pitch for one of the biggest inner-city developments in a decade." "The waterfront?" Tony shook his head. "No, I didn't waste my time on that." "Why not?" Instead of answering, he glanced away. When he brought his attention back, irritation pooled at the corners of his mouth, and there was an edge to his voice. "Because I wasn't prepared to spend money on a window dressing exercise for Glasgow City Council. Let's just say there were people involved who had a lot of influence with certain well-placed individuals and leave it there." He paused. "If it's true, and there's no reason to think it isn't, this one is different." "What makes it different?" "They'll be inviting us. It's a prime chunk of business, but it won't be easy. Winning will depend on us being at the top of our game. Guaranteed we'll be up against big dog agencies from Edinburgh and London, maybe even further afield. To beat them, our ideas will have to be better, stronger, more creative than anything they come up with. Can we do it?" He nodded slowly and answered his own question. "I think we can. In fact, I'm sure of it." Tony was serious, and Julia started to understand where he was going. As he stood beside his new boss, Ellis Kirkbride's expression revealed that what he was hearing wasn't a surprise to him. He'd already been briefed. Old-school male chauvinist that he was, Tony had elected to tell a guy who'd got here 5 minutes ago before he told her. Julia bit her lip in anger and tried not to take it personally. Complaining would label her a touchy female, expecting special treatment because she was a woman, displeased when she didn't get it. The MD's abrasiveness when he felt he was being second-guessed ruffled feathers. In his own words, he couldn't have given a tuppenny damn which snowflake he offended. Today it was her turn. Tony carried on. "So I'm keen to throw everything we have at this, and by everything, I mean you two. The brightest and the best Grapevine has, our very own dream team. Ellis couldn't have arrived at a better moment. I've seen what he's done, what he's capable of, and it's nothing short of excellent. His input and experience will be invaluable. Putting you together makes sense. I'm excited, and it isn't too often these days I can say that. Trust me, it'll be great." Julia drove the Mazda Rob had bought her for Christmas through the early evening traffic from her office in Bothwell Street to the West End flat in Hamilton Drive. Manic Monday might have been coined for the racket, one of Tony Connor's descriptions they were in. It had been a stressful one, and she was mentally exhausted. When she got home, she hurriedly undressed, threw on a grey tracksuit top, navy blue leggings, a pair of white Lululemon Blissfeels, and a sweatband to keep her hair off her face. Running had started as a way to keep fit and push back against the long hours behind a desk. Her favourite route followed the River Kelvin, crossing the bridge on Belmont Street near Glasgow Academy, taking the 53 steps, she'd counted them, down to the other bank and past the stone and brick ruins of the North Woodside Flint Mill, demolished before she was born. After a challenging day at Grapevine, was there any other kind? This tranquil place in the heart of the city energised her and revived her spirit. On early morning jogs, she'd seen roe deer grazing at the water's edge, more grey squirrels than she could count, and even a red fox returning to its earth from a night's hunting. Her mobile rang. She fished it out of her pocket and saw she had a message from Rob. Her husband was a laid-back guy, easy to be around, but his electronic communications were famously curt. This one was no exception. "Got the client from hell. Working on. Don't wait up." Julia wasn't surprised. They were both workaholics. Call-offs were par for the course. She'd lost count of the unused concert tickets, the meals that had gone in the bin, the dinner reservations cancelled at the last minute because one or other of them couldn't make it. She'd even been late for their wedding anniversary due to something coming up at Grapevine. Though Rob could hardly complain, he wasn't pleased. They'd had words and slept in separate rooms. Julia had tossed and turned, knowing she was wasting what should have been a lovely night. Rob hadn't fared any better, and as dawn broke over Glasgow, he'd slipped in beside her. Julia had tried to whisper, "I'm sorry." He'd put a finger against her mouth. His lips had brushed her neck, and she'd moved towards him. Afterwards, lying in each other's arms, they'd made a promise to reevaluate their priorities. The intention was sincere, but of course it hadn't happened and was never going to. They were always too busy. The WhatsApp made Julia question for the zillionth time how they were living their lives. In the early days of the relationship, filled with the recklessness and wild optimism that came naturally with being in love, every other conversation had been about them and what they were going to do. West End flats or climbing the corporate ladder weren't important. Having children barely got a mention. There was time for that stuff. Plenty of time. No, they were going to travel until they'd been everywhere, seen everything there was to see, and felt the warmth of the sun on their faces in strange lands they'd struggled to pinpoint on a map. Sod the future. The future would take care of itself. All that mattered was right now and fantasizing about what was to come. Night after night, they'd lie awake into the small hours, talking in excited whispers about opening a beach hotel in Kerala and sleeping under the stars in hammocks strung between two shady banyan trees. Endless balmy evenings spent with sea salt on their skin, eating jumbo prawns fresh from the Indian Ocean, served in a fragrant coconut curry broth, toasting their good fortune with palm toddy. Most important of all, they'd be together. Where had that dream gone? Julia sat on the grass feeling lonely and alone. Here she was, surrounded by peace and beauty, while Rob was stuck in some stuffy office with people he didn't even like, not sure when he'd be home. It wasn't fair. It wasn't right. And it was time they did something about it. She replied to his message with a sad face and 3 kisses. Suddenly, Julia didn't feel like running anymore and started walking slowly back to the empty flat. They sat across from each other, together but not together, the woman holding the tiny espresso cup delicately between her fingers, watching her companion slumped in the leather armchair, staring at the phone as if it were somehow responsible. Her name was Michelle Davidson, a 31-year-old redhead who was single by choice, a state she was perfectly happy with and didn't care who knew it. She wore a black Karen Mullen pencil dress and high heels that took great legs to the next level. understated pearl earrings were the finishing touch on an outfit that looked as though the elements might have instinctively been drawn together. From the moment Rob Sutherland had taken her hand and introduced himself in his office in Park Circus, the attraction had been there on both sides. Now they were about to go to the room he'd booked that same afternoon, he seemed less sure. He'd messaged his wife, and his conscience was bothering him. Nothing out of the ordinary, so long as he got a grip on himself and started acting like a man. Infidelity always brought guilt, though in her experience it arrived after the sex, not before. Michelle heard resentment in her voice and hated herself for it. "I'm not liking what I see and doing my best not to take it personally." Rob sat up straight, like someone who'd joined a conversation after it had started. "I've no idea what you're talking about." "Don't you? Well, for starters, your face." "What's wrong with my face?" "You look as if you're going to cry." "Don't be ridiculous. It has nothing to do with you." "And is that supposed to make me feel better? Would it shock you to know it doesn't? Boy, you've got making a woman feel good about who she is down to a fine art, haven't you?" "I'm sorry, Michelle, that was clumsy." "Then at least we agree on something. Given the subject, I'm not certain it's a good basis for a relationship, even a very brief one. Perhaps we should finish our coffees and go." The suggestion caught him off guard. "Go? Why would we do that?" She sighed. "Because this is supposed to be fun. Otherwise, why bother?" "It is. I mean, it will be. Julia and I tell each other the truth. Lying takes a bit of getting used to, that's all." Except it wasn't all. The mood was slipping away, and Michelle didn't have the energy to pull it back. "Look, we've been too hasty, rushed this and made a mistake. It isn't the first time and it won't be the last. Let's quit while we're ahead, eh? Apart from my bruised ego, there's no harm done." She glanced at a passing waiter, then back to him. "I assumed you'd been here before. I thought you could handle it." He turned the mobile off, slipped it into his pocket, and replied with a surprisingly forthright confession. "I haven't done this before, Michelle, which is why I'm struggling and making a fool of myself. I've spent most of the day thinking about you, about us. Now,
"We're actually here. You're having doubts."
"No, not doubts. It's just—" She leaned forward.
"You're not comfortable with the deception. I understand, and I'm glad you told me. Most guys wouldn't be secure enough to admit it. They'd pretend this was something they did every other day until their performance told a different story. It says a lot about you."
The compliment wasn't appreciated. It was Rob's turn to take offence. "Does it? Does it really? What does it say?"
"That you're honest."
Rob laughed. "Honest? You're joking, aren't you? If I was honest, I'd be at home instead of about to go to bed with a woman I hardly know." Michelle tried not to feel insulted. He was spooked.
"You're worried about hurting your wife. I like that. It restores my faith in the shitty society we live in. We both have our reasons for being here. People need different things from a relationship. That's why open marriages exist."
"That isn't us." Michelle could have pointed out that he was here with her, but let it go.
"You have a partner, and I'm not looking for one. Julia won't find out. As long as we're careful, there's nothing to be worried about. Where does she think you are? What did you tell her?"
"I said I was working late."
"Working late. Okay, not very original, but okay. Will she believe you? Isn't she supposed to be smart?"
"She will, and she is. The smartest lady I've ever met. No offence." The smile froze on the red lips.
"None taken, but if Julia's so wonderful, the question is, why are you here with me?"
"Because I'm not wonderful. I'm also not smart. We're round the corner from my bloody office, for Christ's sake. All it needs is somebody from work to spot us together."
"So, we're not happening?"
"We're happening, all right. Just not here." Chapter 2. He'd kissed Michelle in the car park one last time before following her tail lights back to the city. She'd put her arms round his neck, and for a second he'd considered taking her back to the room. She'd said,
"Okay, crunch time. Shall I call you or will you call me?"
"I'll call you."
"You'll call me. In other words..."
"Careful, your insecurity's showing."
"You forget I've been here before. I'll call you can be guy speak for don't expect to hear from me again. Why did God have to make men so predictable?" Rob remembered the cynicism in her voice from the conversation in the Hilton as she added, "And that's why I'm not married. Quite frankly, it would be boring, and I don't do boring."
"You've picked the wrong men."
"Really?"
"Yes, really. When I tell someone I'll call, a woman, a man, anybody, I mean I'll call. It isn't complicated."
Michelle stepped back to get a better look at him. "And that's a promise, is it?"
"That's a promise."
"God help me, I almost believe you."
This woman had everything. Looks, intelligence, sensuality, even a jaded way of seeing things he found attractive. In a word, she was nice, and more vulnerable than she'd seemed to him at the beginning of the evening, when she was the one making the running and he would have called it off. Yet she wasn't wrong. In spite of her obvious attributes, he wouldn't be calling her. The sex had been good. Better than good. The sex had been great, actually, though not great enough to risk his marriage. Good, great, or somewhere in between. It wouldn't be repeated. His nerves couldn't stand it. Early in the conversation, she'd said something that had stayed with him.
"I assumed you'd been here before. I thought you could handle it."
A sour smile played on Rob's lips. He couldn't, and there was no point pretending he could. At this rate, he'd have a heart attack and be dead before he was 30. On the drive home, he'd gone over what he'd tell Julia if she was waiting for him, rehearsing his annoyance over the weight of his imaginary workload, defaming his boss and the endless demands of planning. By the time he got to a deserted Hamilton Drive, he'd almost fallen for it himself. Rob turned off the ignition and listened to the engine as it cooled in the night air, knowing he had only himself to blame for the sinking sensation in his stomach and his elevated heartbeat hammering in his chest. The faith he'd momentarily had in the fiction created to cover where he'd been and what he'd actually been doing had been short-lived. Now it seemed like something a child would invent, and for a while he wasn't sure if he had the courage to get out of the car. He bent forward and rested his forehead against the steering wheel, close to despair. This could have been avoided. Except, instead of recognizing the folly Michelle represented, he'd given in to temptation. And here he was. For all her undoubted charms, he didn't love her and never would. Young, free and single, she could do what she wanted with whoever she wanted. Her risk was no risk at all. The same couldn't be said of him. Life had rules, and everything, every act of omission or commission, had consequences. He didn't deserve to get away with what he'd done. If he did, he'd be a lucky boy. A very lucky boy indeed. Rob cut the self-pity short. It was useless and changed nothing. Being sorry after the event, or because Julia might find out and leave him, wasn't regret in any real sense. He was supposed to be a loving husband, but when the test had come, he'd failed spectacularly. The opportunity to honour the vows they'd made to each other had been there, yet, with clear knowledge and full consent, he'd abandoned them for Michelle's arms. It was too late for sackcloth and ashes. Mea culpa was a feeble cop-out, and using the fact he and Julia hadn't exactly been firing lately was pitiful. Better to admit, at least to himself, what had really happened and be done with it. A woman, and not just any woman, a sensuous lady well aware of her power, had made a move on him. Pathetic and weak, he'd let his animal instincts make the decision. He got out of the car and crossed the street, relieved to see the flat in darkness. Of course, that didn't mean Julia was asleep. If she was waiting for him, the chances of her believing the fairy tale he had ready were slim. His wife knew him better than anyone on earth. She'd sussed something was wrong, and it would all come out. The thought of discovery made him shudder. What a bloody idiot he'd been. Michelle was a beautiful woman, a wonderful lover. Tonight had been everything illicit sex was supposed to be: exhilarating, satisfying, dangerous. Fine, so long as it didn't become a classic example of how to screw your life up. If his wife was awake, other than lie, what could he do? Telling the truth would destroy her. It would destroy them. But asking her to blindly accept he'd been working only added insult to an injury she must never discover. Julia was the centre of Rob's universe, his everything. Cheating on her had been the last thing on his mind when he'd taken the sapphire and gold ring from the little box in his pocket and put it on her finger in the sun-washed gardens of the Taj Mahal. He could still see the joy in her face. A special memory tainted. Remembering that moment brought a fresh wave of shame. So much for extravagant romantic gestures. Rob closed the front door quietly and slipped off his shoes, praying his wife wouldn't hear the old floorboards groaning under his step. At the sink, he poured a glass of water and drank it in 2 gulps while the silence around him roared. Tomorrow, or more accurately, today, he had a site meeting in Ayrshire at 8 o'clock and another in the afternoon out in South Lanarkshire. Somewhere in between, he'd get back to writing the report he'd been roped into presenting at the end of the week to the senior partners. Suddenly, the sheer normality of his life before tonight seemed a precious thing, and he swore at himself for being a damned fool to jeopardise it with a one-night stand. He undressed on the landing and eased the bedroom door open, half expecting to see Julia in bed reading a book. In spite of the water he'd drunk, his mouth was dry, though his palms and the back of his neck were sweating. Before he'd left Michelle, Rob had showered to remove any trace of her. When he'd come out, her smiling comment hadn't amused him. "You said you hadn't done this before." "I haven't." "So how come you know the rule?" "What rules?" "Rule, singular. There really is only one." "And what is it?" "Don't get caught. Get that right, and you don't need any more." The lamp was on at his side of the bed. The novel she'd been reading had fallen from her exhausted fingers onto the duvet when her attempt to stay awake finally failed. In repose, his wife looked like an angel, innocent, without guile of any kind. Rob tried to imagine her doing what he'd just done, and couldn't. He got into bed and turned out the light. Sleep was a million miles away. He lay with his hands behind his head, thinking of something to do for his wife, something that would make her happy and salve his tortured conscience. Under the sheets, the warmth of Julia's body was like a summer's day. Rob wanted to be close to her. Lingering remorse forced him to keep his distance. Chapter 3. Julia's fingers reached across the bed, searching for her husband, not finding him. She slowly opened her eyes and saw he wasn't there. If he hadn't come home, something was wrong. Julia shot a worried glance at the clock on the bedside table and relaxed when she realised it was 7:10. Rob had mentioned a site meeting in Ayrshire. Darkest Ayrshire, he'd called it. Panic over. Her workaholic husband, darling man that he was, had left without waking her. Julia was glad nothing was amiss, though she couldn't help feeling disappointed. In their hectic lives, mornings had become the time when they talked, drank their favourite Jamaica Blue Mountain coffee in bed, and made love before going their separate ways to work. It would have been nice if he came through the door with 2 tall Americanos and a couple of almond croissants and got back in beside her. It seemed an age since they'd been together with nothing to think about but each other. At first she didn't notice the folded rectangle of paper on the pillow. Rob was always leaving little messages for her around the house, probably imagining they went in the bin, unaware his wife kept them in a battered tea tin that had belonged to her grandmother. This would be the latest addition to the collection. Years down the line, when she was old and grey, she'd read her love letters from the past and relive what they'd found all over again. The note was short, but very, very sweet. "Love you to bits. R." Kiss, kiss, kiss. With Rob already gone, there was no point in Julia hanging about the flat. It made sense to get a start on the day before anyone else arrived. 25 minutes later, she'd showered and dressed and was getting into her car. In Boswell Street, she grabbed a cappuccino from Pret-a-Manger and took the stairs rather than the lift to her office. Ellis Kirkbride was standing in the centre of the room studying the marketing material for the campaign her team had been working on, pinned to the cork board covering most of the wall. He was wearing a black shirt, black cords under an orange body warmer, and white Nike Air Max 90 trainers with a distinctive swoosh on the side. Her marketeer's instinct homed in on the logo. His arms were folded across his chest, and as she watched, he reached out to straighten a leaflet, tilted his head to inspect what he'd done, quietly mouthing something she wasn't able to make out. A criticism? Julia couldn't say, but for sure the new guy wasn't short on confidence. This was her space. He had no business being here unless she invited him, and absolutely none when she hadn't. Julia coughed theatrically to get the unwelcome visitor's attention. Ellis turned and smiled, not remotely bothered by being discovered. "It's yourself. Didn't realise you were there." Her reply was tart. "Didn't you? This is my office, or at least it was the last time I checked." He ignored the rebuke and pointed to the wall. "I see you've been busy. Has the client approved it?" Julia wasn't in the mood to discuss it. "Not yet." The answer set him off on a stroll down memory lane that might have been intended to come across as empathy. He said, "Whenever this sort of remit used to land on my desk, I shuddered. Banks and building societies are the worst companies to work with, expecting us to take dull products and somehow, Christ knows how, make them sexy. Not gonna happen. It isn't possible. You've gone down the tried and tested we're here to help route. Very wise, if you don't mind me saying. I would have done the same. It's not true, of course. These people aren't in the business of helping anybody except themselves. Then again, this is marketing. What's truth got to do with it, eh?" It hurt Julia to admit he was right. They'd spent weeks hashing out concepts, trying to come up with something, anything that wasn't so obviously done to death. With the deadline running out, they'd given up on originality and compromised on a revamped version of every financial service campaign since the dawn of time, trusting that a modern twist to the graphics would carry the themes. It wasn't their finest hour, and Julia would have preferred Ellis Kirkbride hadn't seen it. If he'd respected her space and stayed outside the office until she got there, he wouldn't have. Ellis took a last look at the stuff on the wall and turned to face her. "Tony's told me great things about you. I'm looking forward to working together." "Let's hope we can." The negativity took him by surprise. "Well, of course we can. Why wouldn't we? What do you mean?" "I mean, he obviously rates you, which is fine, but I'm a team player. Are you?" "Am I a—" "For sure. Absolutely. We have to be able to think, to use a cliché, outside the box. Nobody, certainly not me, has a monopoly in ideas. Every marketing project is a problem searching for a solution. The doorman can come up with a strapline so long as it's effective." His eyes stayed on her. "Why on earth would you think I'd be anything else?" He sounded sincere. Julia felt herself mellow. "My sentiments exactly. As for what's on that wall, you're right. It was a dog when it arrived, and it'll still be a dog when they sign off on it. Bog standard stuff. But it's the client's money. If they're happy, who are we to disagree?" Ellis nodded. "Take the box and move on. For the record, I like what you've done with it. It's solid." "Solid or stolid?" He laughed. "A bit of both. I'll give you that, but hey, look, I can only imagine what was in your head when Tony gave that big build-up, then dumped me on you. If it had been the other way round, boss or not, I'd have had plenty to say about it." "I did. You were there. He doesn't care whose toes he steps on. Grapevine is his own little kingdom. He rules like a benevolent despot. One treasonous word and it's off with your expense account." She laughed. "Close enough. When His Majesty makes a decision, that's it. Obviously, he's made his mind up about you. The intro. Ellis ran a finger through the stubble in his jaw and grimaced. Yeah, it was embarrassing. I wanted to shout, "For fuck's sake, Tony, I have to get along with these people. They'll hate me before I've even started. Give me a break." Julia reassured him. Nobody will hate you. Though I'm curious, South Africa is the other side of the planet. What took you down there? It's a long story. Give me the short version. I'm not sure there is one. He aimed a mock-accusing finger at her. You're not backward at coming forward, are you? The rebuke was mild, but Julia felt it. I'm sorry, it's none of my business. Forget I asked. Ellis's smile didn't make it to his eyes. Julia was on the point of saying something else when the phone on her desk rang. Tony Connors could be a man of few words when it suited him. This was one of those times. He said, Julia, my office. Now, is Ellis there? Yes, bring him with you. It was a typical morning on the west coast of Scotland, sunshine and blue skies ruined by a chill wind blowing from the Firth of Clyde, ruffling the hair and ruddying the cheeks of the group of serious-looking men with Rob. Above, the quiet drone of a Ryanair jet on its descent towards Prestwick Airport broke into his thoughts as he pretended to listen to the contract manager explain how the environmental challenges of the site were being overcome to turn featureless land into an enclave of expensive properties enjoying magnificent views across the water to the island of Arran. Rob had been to scores of meetings exactly like this one and could recite by heart the bullet points on the manager's list. From time to time he nodded to give the illusion of somebody who was interested in what was being said. In fact, he couldn't have cared less. He'd lain awake most of the night, racked with guilt, staring at the ceiling until dawn's early light washed over the city. Now, standing in a scrubby field with salt air nipping his eyes, he remembered the uncertainty in Michelle's voice. Shall I call you or will you call me? And the untruth that had come so easily to his lips. He'd lied to bring the shameful episode of betrayal and monumental stupidity to a close and send her on her way as gently as he could. Whatever he'd said, whatever promises he'd made, they wouldn't see each other again. At least not like that. 2 hours earlier, when he'd scribbled the note and left it on the pillow next to Julia, that had been his sincere belief. Rob felt his face flush and knew it had nothing to do with sea air because, mistake or not, against all reason, he wanted to repeat it over and over and over again. Given his position in the company, it would have been reasonable to expect Tony Connor's office to have a view of the river. It didn't, and even if it had, the MD was too busy to spend valuable time admiring it. Today, wearing a black double-breasted pinstripe suit with a white open-necked shirt, he might have been a successful hippie who traded peace and love for stocks and shares. There was no tie. That would have been too straight. Julia guessed he was having lunch with one of his female friends and hoped the girl would enjoy whatever overpriced wine Tony ordered. He waited for Julia and Ellis to sit down, rested his elbows on the desk and steepled his fingers in front of him before he began. I assume you've guessed why you're here, Julia said. The development you talked about? He clasped his hands together and nodded. The jungle drums were spot on. It's official. We've been asked to pitch. He tossed a folder on the desk. I'll have this copied myself and over to you in the next hour. When you've read it, I want you to start working right away. I've already block-booked meeting room 1. Keep the blinds drawn and the door locked. Initially, it'll just be the two of you. Once you tie down the grabber, we'll involve whoever else we need. Tony saw the disbelief in their eyes. And before you start thinking I've gone all James Bond on you, remember, this is a big deal. Grapevine is small, just 23 people, not including the cleaners. What you generate is intellectual property. In other words, gold. Protecting it is our responsibility. At the end of the day, ideas are what this business is about. Let's not give somebody an advantage, eh? The MD wasn't quite finished. 2 more points. Don't discuss what you're doing with anybody, and don't leave stuff lying around. He turned to Julia as she was about to speak. And yes, that includes the rest of your team. I appreciate it doesn't sit well with you, but that's how it has to be. Before you give me 100 good reasons why it can't, hear this. I don't care what you have to farm out. Clear the decks. Ellis asked, "What's the remit?" Tony leaned back in his chair. What it's always about. Identity. He reached for the folder and lifted a glossy A4 sheet with an artist's impression of a sleek building rising into a cloudless sky and pushed it towards them. Imagine this thing of beauty and gleaming glass and steel. High-end retailing and hospitality on the lower floors, luxury apartments from there on up to the penthouse suites. Julia caught the excitement in Tony's voice and said, "Nice." Her reaction fell a long way short of his expectations. He barked his displeasure. "Nice? Is that the best you can do? Christ almighty, aren't you supposed to have vision? Then use it. Imagine this in the centre of the city, and you're looking at the future of Glasgow, people. Wow, that isn't the Glasgow I know." "Exactly, Ellis. It isn't the Glasgow any of us know. Not yet, though it will be." He tapped the picture with his finger. "Two more are in the pipeline, approved and ready to go, and that will only be the start. The concept isn't new, far from it, but the project is a public-private partnership. In this case, the City Council and Campbell Coleridge Limited, a bunch of councillors who know sweet FA about anything, and an award-winning builder with a track record that goes back 100 years, but in a marketing sense hasn't taken on anything like this. It'll change the face of the city and have a huge profile. Failure isn't an option. It has to succeed." They sat in silence, letting what Tony had told them sink in until Ellis said, "So what specifically is the brief?" "Simple. Glasgow is about to have a new landmark. Actually, 3 new landmarks. As of now, the project doesn't have an identity. Our challenge is to create one. One that has the name on everybody's lips. People have to be drooling at the prospect, buying bloody lottery tickets, hoping they win enough to be able to afford even the lower floors. Aspirational living is the name of the game. So, give me a concept head and shoulders above anything the other agencies come up with. You've got 3 weeks. So, no pressure then." Julia would have laughed, except it wasn't a joke. Chapter 4. When she got to her office, she shut the door and stood with her back pressed against it. Tony Connors was a demanding boss who accepted nothing less than 100% from everybody, including himself, dismissing problems with a wave of his hand and the mantra, "Merely a challenge to which we shall rise." But this was different, and he'd been open about how much it meant to him. His ego had decided the outcome of the pitch he'd tasked them with delivering. Success was the only option. Grapevine wasn't a gig for the faint-hearted. Tony had never intended it would be. He was at the centre, driving the company forward. In some respects a trailblazer, in others a dinosaur, the last of his kind, who jokingly, though not inaccurately, described himself at a Christmas staff party after he'd had a few too many as Don Quixote on acid. Despite his boorishness and casual misogynism, not unusual in the male-oriented realm of advertising, Julia enjoyed working for him. Today's meeting had left her spooked. Being trusted to work on such an important pitch was a compliment, yet she was unhappy at having to exclude the rest of the team. As always, her first instinct was to call Rob the centre of her universe. Husband, lover, partner, and above all, her friend. The person she relied on when life got too much. From the moment they'd met, just being together had been magical. Changing her name to Mrs. Sutherland was the easiest decision she'd ever made. And 3 years on, there were no regrets, apart from the time they seemed to be spending apart. Julia called him again with no better luck, swore quietly to herself, and walked to the window. Outside on Boswell Street, people rushed about their business, while a double line of cars waited for the traffic lights to change. The familiar scene calmed her, and Julia settled down to read the contents of the folder. From the overview on the first page, she immediately understood Tony's enthusiasm. He hadn't exaggerated. The project was a very big deal. A few of the building atrocities of the late 1960s and 1970s, when cheap was sold as modern, were still standing, concrete blots on the landscape that, with the benefit of hindsight, should never have been allowed. The images she was looking at were very different, though in their own way just as controversial, a sharp and futuristic mix of styles that at first glance she wasn't sure she liked. Her husband was the architect in the family. Julia couldn't say if the development was progress, but it would certainly alter the character of the city centre and wouldn't be short of detractors. She and Ellis were about to work up a marketing strategy for the first step in this massive regeneration programme. A lot more than Tony Connor's ego and Grapevine's status in the business depended on getting it right. Not a thought she wanted to dwell on. The phone rang on her desk. Rob. He sounded irritated and distracted. Sorry, I was in another meeting. Honestly, it's the same every day in this place. Don't know how we're expected to get anything done. Most of them are a waste of bloody time when I could be doing something useful. He caught himself whining and paused. Okay, rant over. What's happening in your world? Her husband was usually unflappable, taking everything in his stride. When things didn't go to plan, Julia would scream and use language her mother wasn't aware she had in her vocabulary. Rob didn't let things get to him. His reaction was to joke about them. Complaining was out of character and made Julia frown on the other end of the line. Rob, is everything all right? You sound... What? I don't know. Stressed? I'm fine. Some days are harder to get through than others. Tell me about it. In case you've forgotten, I work for Tony Connors. He's lucky to have you. I'm not sure he would agree. Tell him if you want to be underappreciated, you can stay at home. Julia laughed. That was the Rob she knew and loved, and her concern melted. How was Ayrshire? Cold. Remind me never to buy a house near the sea. Julia laughed. I wouldn't worry too much about that. Where we are is great, if only we were together more often to enjoy it. Her voice softened to a whisper. I missed you this morning. Pleased to hear it. No, Rob, I'm serious. I can't tell you how disappointed I was when I found you weren't in bed with me. Believe me, Julia, dragging myself out at stupid o'clock isn't my idea of the good life. I'll make it up to you when we get home. Julia bit her lip, suddenly reminded of why she'd phoned. Put a pin in that promise. I'll collect on it later. What's the problem? I have to work late. How late? Late enough. I'm not sure. Grapevine's been invited to pitch for a prestigious piece of business. Tony is mustard keen on winning it. I'm afraid it's going to be my obsession for the next few weeks. Sorry, baby. Now who's disappointed? Julia detected a trace of resentment, but when Rob spoke again, it was gone. Got to hand it to old Tony. He can definitely spot talent. Whatever the pitch is for, he couldn't have anybody better on it than you. Then you forgive me. How could I do anything else? This morning it was me who spoiled the party. Tonight it's your turn. I'll survive, somehow. Remind me how the microwave works again, will you? You know very well how it works. He kept the joke going. Maybe I do and maybe I don't. We're about to find out, aren't we? Is Tony actually going to do some work for a change, or is he leaving that to somebody else? It'll be me and Ellis Kirkbride. I haven't heard that name before. He's new. And Connors teams him up with you on a landmark project. What's this guy's story? I don't know much about him, but apparently he's lived abroad and done some great stuff in the past. Tony really rates him. It certainly sounds as though he does. What's he like? Julia hesitated without knowing why. Ellis, he's okay, I suppose. A bit of a big head, but all right once you get past that. Is he good looking? I haven't really noticed. I don't believe you. Let's just say he's all right and leave it at that, shall we? I'm taking that as a yes. Rob Sutherland, is that jealousy I'm hearing? Julia giggled, picturing him grinning down the line. He played along. Jealousy, no. It's what I'd call proprietorial self-interest. In other words, it is jealousy. Rob didn't disagree. I'm taking care of what's mine like any husband. Julia saw a chance to make a point. As I recall, you weren't taking care of much this morning. In fact, if Ellis had been handy, I'd have pummeled his ugly face to a pulp. He doesn't have an ugly face. Not yet. He will have when I'm finished with him. They laughed for a moment, as close as they'd ever been. Julia hated to be the one to end it. No need to worry about him or anybody else. All I'll be doing tonight is drinking lukewarm coffee and trying to come up with ideas that don't stink the place out. When will you be home? As soon as I can, promise.